Hello, hello, vinyl community. It's my cat. Um, anyway, I thought I would make a video after watching a bunch of other people's videos. Um, I've never done something like this exactly, so I don't know how this will go. I'm going to introduce myself with sort of the, the way I got into music. I grew up in suburbia in the suburbs of Dallas, Texas. It's sort of a wasteland. I was uh, exposed to the music my parents had, mostly my dad, I guess. So he had some Beatles and some other stuff. So I heard some of that, and I remember listening to Cat Stevens and um, various things growing up that I liked. But really, I owe a lot of my musical development to my friendship with a guy named Gary, and music meant a lot to him. And we met at a time when I was just starting to get into things as an adult, basically when I was around 17, and starting to appreciate things more deeply and come out of my sort of um, cocoon of uh, suburban youth and become maybe a full-fledged human being somewhat. Anyway, start out with, as for a lot of people, their introduction to music is the Beatles. Or that's a gateway drug into music, sort of, because it's the most popular one, and well, everybody loves the Beatles, most everybody. Anyway, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to show some of my musical pathways, I guess, and then show my favorite album. One thing that's really sad is over the years, I've often been broke and had to sell records uh, and moved and had to fit all my possessions into a tiny '78 Toyota Corolla, and of course records weigh a lot and take up a lot of space. And then the thing that was even more devastating to a lot of our record collections was the advent of CDs. It felt sort of, uh, I don't know, gluttonous, or I don't know, something to have both the LP and the CD. Felt like, I don't know, people would think you were hanging on to some, I don't know. Anyway, so a lot of times, I remember when CDs first started out in record stores um, in the 80s. I remember a great record store here in Austin, Texas, called, at the time it was called Record Exchange. They had basically a little box like this filled with CDs, and they were all import CDs, and they all cost like $20, which was a lot at the time because you could get new vinyl, which I'm always telling people about this now. You could get new vinyl records. They had the on sale records of that time uh, on sale for like $5.99, $6.99, $7.99. A record that I picked up at that time was, and I mention this because Derek on YouTube mentioned how much he loves the Chameleons. Anyway, Strange Times I picked up new when it came out for $6.99, and it was a single LP with a free EP that came with it. So these two great records. Anyway, for $6.99. But so those CDs were really expensive, but you're like, oh, I have to upgrade to CDs, or I wish I could hear what that sounded like on CD because it would be so clean and pure, and you could. One thing, there are definitely obviously some nice things about CDs. Like it's nice to be able to put on a, but there are also nice things about LPs, obviously, or we wouldn't be doing this. But it is nice with CDs that we could put on an album and have it go all the way to the end in one sitting without you having to get up. Or if you like want to go to sleep to a record and your turntable doesn't, like my turntable doesn't catch the record at the end when it's done. So you wouldn't want your needle to be spinning on the loop all on that line, wearing down the needle. But anyway, okay, back to the story. So first group, Beatles, Gateway Drug. favorite album by the Beatles, the White Album. This is not the White Album that I used to have. This is a White Album I picked up sometime in the past couple of years just to have it on vinyl again. So it's in shitty shape. It's a reissue, etc. Anyway, so from the Beatles, um, I have this other friend who's a big music friend, and we used to talk about how Sonic Youth was sort of a gateway drug to a lot of weirder music and weird, I don't know. Like once you're listening to music like Sonic Youth, you're probably into some other weird stuff at that point, all across the board. So it's sort of like a marker almost. Anyway, I forget why I mentioned that. But okay, so like with Beatles, often you start off with the early perfect pop song Beatles, and then just like the Beatles, and listening to it um, uh, as you do, like maybe from the first few records on through their catalog, if you want to do it chronologically, which is a fun way to do it because then you sort of grow with the Beatles. Although obviously people probably heard stuff from Sgt. Pepper or later stuff first, but it's neat to go through the progression that they went through. One of my favorite Beatles documentary, or a great music documentary, I don't know, a great Beatles documentary is called The Complete Beatles, which is out of print and it's never been on DVD, which I don't understand. It's probably some stupid rights issue. But anyway, it's this great Beatles documentary, um, narrated by Malcolm McDowell, which is sort of interesting, the actor. But it was neat watching that documentary where they talked about how the Beatles were influenced by Dylan and that made their music more serious, and the huge fame they had, you know, caused them to you know think about, I don't know, their place in the world. I don't know, but their music evolved, and so it's hard to believe that the Beatles of Please Please Me is the same Beatles of Revolution 9 from White Album, which, well, that's, I guess you could say that's more of a John Lennon, Yoko Ono creation almost. But anyway, well, and speaking of Yoko Ono and John Lennon, my favorite Lennon solo album is Plastic Ono Band, which is sort of sad in a way because it's his first. But so I went through my obsession with the Beatles, and then that evolved into an obsession with John Lennon. Um, and then Gary and I were listening to a lot of David Bowie. Um, and again, it's great to start with an artist, find that you like the artist, and then go through their catalog, and you sort of evolve with their mind and their mental state through their creations. Um, I love so many David Bowie records. I would have to say that I love more David Bowie records than any other rock artist as far as creating a number of great albums. I mean, there are people like Dylan who made a lot of good albums, but I like the songs of Dylan more than the whole albums, and and I don't like a lot of the Dylan stages, and I like more, the early to mid '60s stuff most, I guess, except for, I don't know, there other stuff later, but um, and obviously Bowie, his later stuff isn't as great, but I have to say I love at least like 7 albums of David Bowie, which I think is sort of unheard of to like that many albums by an artist in the rock genre or whatever. Anyway, my favorite Bowie, I would have to say, and this is a really hard decision, but I would say is Station to Station. Um, for a long time, I would have said Low, but there's a certain aspect to the depression of that album that I can't listen to it as often, and I like the sort of power that this album has, especially the title track, "Fly Like a Demon from Station to Station." Powerful stuff. Anyway, um, then after Beatles and Bowie, it's like there was a migration to uh, more current music, which again for me we're talking about when I was in my late teens, in the mid '80s. So I was starting to get into bands that were from the post-punk era, I guess, and So I went from Beatles to Lennon to uh, Bowie, and then boom, alternative rock or whatever it was called at that time. It was like this wonderful scene to find, much as like a lot of people are really happy to have found the vinyl collecting scene on YouTube and whatnot. The alternative music scene at that time, uh, it really felt much more secret in a way than. I mean, there's so many people are into vinyl and record stores and stuff. I mean, there were record stores then too, obviously, but I guess it was because I felt so alone at that time in my life, growing up in the suburbs of Dallas, and I didn't really have a clique or a lot of friends, basically just Gary. And so whenever one of us found out about some new band, it was a huge thing. If it was a group that really meant a lot to us, and we both sort of absorbed their catalog when that happened. Anyway, so after Bowie, the next thing was, and obviously it wasn't just one thing at a time, but there were lots of influences that you were hit with. But at that time, uh, I was introduced to the Smiths, and maybe even before that was the Sex Pistols. That's basically just one album that they really made. And that album has a lot of power in it, and I was angry and frustrated at that time. I just dropped out of college. It was uh, still having unrequited love situations, which were very painful, and I didn't know what the heck to do with my life. Anyway, so I burned through a sort of Sex Pistols page and stage, and then into the Smiths. And then the Smiths were my favorite band at that point. I mean, I still love all this other music that I'm talking about, but go through these phases. And the Smiths were a big phase because, again, I could really relate to Morrissey's songs, the lyrics, the emotions, the longing, I guess, especially at that time. Then after the Smiths, the next big thing that hit me in probably the biggest way, almost of anything at that time, was Joy Division, the first album, Unknown Pleasures. It's an amazing record. Um, I'll actually open this record because this is something that when I found out about it a while ago, I was like, oh man, I have to get that edition of the vinyl. Because I had seen this picture of Unknown Pleasures that someone had shown a photo of, and it was this neat translucent brown vinyl, which hadn't seen before. And I won't be able to show that here because it looks like it's not translucent. It just looks like a record when you hold it up normally. But if you hold it up to light, even not very much light, it's translucent and you can see through it. And I was like, am I imagining this? Is this something you can do with all records? But you can see through it. And, it's this neat brown translucence. I don't know. Surely it's not just that it's an especially thin layer of vinyl, hopefully. I don't know. But anyway, this record, I said for, I mean, I don't know if you've gone through a stage where people ask you who your favorite band is and you say, for me, it would have been the Beatles, then John Lennon, then David Bowie, then the Smiths, and then Joy Division. And that was huge for me. Then the next thing for me was discovering this group, which so far almost all these, yeah, all these groups or individuals I mentioned. Again, these are like some big basic ones that everybody goes through. But I guess it's natural that as you go through your music evolution, you start to branch out and become more individualized and have more outlying things in your musical taste that other people won't necessarily share, which is inevitable. And so here's one for me that had a huge, super huge impact. Throwing Muses, their first album. This is like, I don't know, 1985, 86. Uh, I found out about them a little after this had come out. I didn't get this like right when it came out. I got their next album right when it came out. But anyway, this is, and sadly, again, this is my favorite album by them, their first record. Joy Division, I don't like Closer as much because it's just too horribly sad, I guess. I've always likened it to being on an experience with Ian Curtis where he walks you to the edge of a cliff and then he jumps off. And then you're sort of like somewhat compelled to jump off with him, which I was emotionally at that time in my life. I even got to feeling that certain records, were dangerous for me to listen to, or were programming me to be more depressed than I was, or that I needed to be. Uh, I don't want to make it sound like I'm crazy or that's some kind of weird musical conspiracy or something, but that music made me very depressed, and I felt like I couldn't listen to it as much, and that's why I like Unknown Pleasures a lot more than Closer. Anyway, this also is a very depressing record in a lot of ways, but also again very powerful, very cathartic, and I guess that's what a lot of us look for when we're looking for music. One of the things I really look for in music today is I like music that makes me want to jump around and dance to it or sing to it. Anyway, so after going through these musical experiences, and again, it's really sad that the next things I'm grabbing to show are things that I have on CD that I haven't been able to get on vinyl yet. I don't know if I will be able to. But another thing that I'll put in this video is I would say my two favorite rock records, and I mean, obviously this is a hard thing to say definitively, but would be Throwing Muses' first record, Throwing Muses, and this record, which should not come as a surprise to most people. I don't know, it's a great freaking record. The Stooges, Funhouse. I remember getting their first LP after, as you do with music collecting, you hear about various groups and you hear descriptions of groups or their influence on people, and you think, wow, um, you know, you hear about the Stooges, and got their first record, and I wasn't as impressed with the Stooges' first record as I had expected to be. It was a little bare sounding. I don't want to say cold. It just, I'm really curious what they would have sounded like live at that time. I know it's produced by John Cale. Um, Maybe he wasn't the right producer for that album. I mean, aren't you really curious if you like the Stooges at all, what their first album might have sounded like if it was recorded by someone else, or if it was for a live recording? I don't know. To me, I've always wondered that, I guess. But I like Funhouse just infinitely more. Um, but again, back with music and how you start to branch off in all these different directions, especially once you discover alternative music. First is alternative rock, but then all the other alternatives that are out there, alternative classical, alternative jazz music, the stuff that isn't played on mainstream radio that most people wouldn't be able to tell you about, but a few people, it's like, hey man, I want to get some free jazz. This is John Coltrane Meditations. I had heard of John Coltrane obviously before, and this is a strange place to start listening to John Coltrane, or even free jazz for that matter to some extent. But a friend of mine told me about this record, and it's one of those almost instantaneous epiphanies. I remember first time I got, I had a teacher who I liked a lot. She gave me a copy of T.S. Eliot's poetry, and I remember the first time reading through like the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, and I didn't quite get it, and it was like confusing to me. It's like does not compute. Um, but then I picked it up like 6 months or a year later, and I just glanced at it, and I could totally relate and totally understand what he was saying. Um, with Meditations by John Coltrane, which again is sort of like being born in the middle of a war zone as far as an experience to come upon John Coltrane's music, you don't start with this record. You start with, I would have someone start with Africa Brass or Live at Birdland or something, or My Favorite Things, something like that maybe, if you're going to start with a free-ish Coltrane record. But this is like being born in the middle of a traffic accident or something. I mean, and he described this music sort of similarly to that. And the first few seconds of listening to it, I was like, again, it's sort of like this does not compute. It's like noise. It's like bombardment. But then uh, the epiphany came faster, um, and I started to experience it as this free feeling, like or similar to the feeling of being like strapped to a, you know, an Apollo rocket going into space and rocketing you away from the petty concerns of the moment you're in a way. You are on a much bigger experience than the trivial moment that you're locked into at that moment. Um, and John Coltrane's music just has so much energy. Anyway, so now if I look at my record collection again, sadly, I'm looking at some CD racks. These are my LPs. These are my CDs. Um, uh, all these Coltrane records are all in CD format, but I have twice as many Coltrane records as I have uh, anybody else, music by anybody else. Again, David Bowie, I probably have like 7 or 8 David Bowie records, and I have twice that many Coltrane records. Anyway, sorry this introduction is so long. Jesus, I didn't mean to go this long. I know a lot of people have that problem with this stuff, but and I've done it too. I hope this has been somewhat interesting, and I'll try to focus myself better for other videos. One of the things I like with some of the other people who do videos on the vinyl community is just how passionate they are about the music, and I think I've rattled off more than I've really expressed the passion I feel, maybe, and I hope to communicate what I feel about the music better in other videos. Anyway, hello, thank you.